All right, we're going to look at Plato's Republic today. And we're not going to look at the whole of Plato's Republic because it is 10 books and the subjects in that work are huge, the number of topics. It is Plato's most famous work, and it deals with a wide array of subjects. And what I'm interested in as a lit student, a literature professor, is how he engages with literature. But I can't ignore that the entirety of the work is devoted to a slightly different topic, which is the topic of justice. This is a work about justice, which is a large topic. It's a topic of perennial interest, including to you. And what Socrates is asked to do by a variety of individuals is to define justice and to speak to some of the things that his opponents present. And in this, Plato gives us probably one of his most mature expositions on the topic. In Book 1, one of his interlocutors, whose name is Thrasymachus, says that justice is the rich and powerful getting what they want. Which is what today's social justice warriors say. In the idea of intersectionality, you get the notion of power, access, privilege, and so forth. And I don't know if you've seen the wheel, so the wheel of oppression, as it were, but by virtue of various identity group markers, you are closer to the center of the wheel. And when you tick a whole variety of boxes there, you either have access and power and privilege, or you don't. And if you don't, then it's unjust, and if you do, then for the rich and the powerful and the privileged, it's just. And so the claim being made by the social justice warrior, so-called, or by the intersectional portrait, is that really is that of Thrasymachus. That justice is the rich and the powerful and the privileged getting what they want, and they call it justice. But is it really justice? Well, we're going to start off with Socrates' response to that. Is Thrasymachus' definition, is the definition of those who present intersectionality or identity group notions of justice, is that conception of justice actually what justice is? Before we decide that we're going to prosecute injustice or stand for justice, is the definition correct? It's a reasonable question. Socrates is never lacking in discernment, and he is never satisfied with just accepting what other people have said simply because they've said it or happen to be authorities on this. And in this case, he's going to take strong issue with it. He's going to say that this definition of justice is the exact opposite of what justice is. This is not justice. It might be the experience of people facing the justice system. But the rich and the powerful getting what they want is not justice. And the social justice crowd would actually agree. It isn't. It isn't justice. It's injustice. Socrates might actually agree in some ways. But the question is, if you simply reverse it so that the excluded, the marginalized, the oppressed, whatever, are given what they want, and the rich, the powerful, the privileged, whatever, get that taken away from them, does that give justice? And the answer is also no. Because then it isn't appealing to any concept of justice. It's just simply possessing and dispossessing. And there's no principle that you can call just which is going to apply to one and all. That's the real issue. So the portrait of justice that Thrasymachus presents is a very cynical one in which justice is impossible to achieve, but some people will use the word justice to justify their transgressions. And the truth is that many people experience this with the justice system, for which reason they're very angry. And rightly so. But Plato is going to make a much stronger argument for justice than simply that the poor are treated badly and the rich are unfairly privileged. He's going to want to ensure that we understand that there is such a thing as justice. And this work, The Republic, he is going to maintain that the purpose of the city or the republic is to execute justice, to make sure justice happens. It's called the Republic. That's the Latin translation, the res publica, the thing of the public. In Greek, it's called the polis, which is the Greek city-state, Polis, from which we get political and politics. The city-state's just the polis. And Cicero will write a work called Res Publica, which is roughly based on this. And so we often in English get the Latinized version of this. Let me say a little bit about Plato here and about the context. I've said a bit about this already because we've talked about the Greek world. Socrates and Plato both represent a sort of a philosophical revolt against Homer and the poetic way of understanding the world. I said to you that that Homer was the teacher of all the Greeks. That's how he was regarded. And his two epics and some of his hymns and so forth made Homer the revered teacher of all the Greeks, irrespective of which state they belonged to. By the way, Greece was not Greece in the sense of a nation. There were city-states. There was Athens, there was Sparta, there was Thebes, there was Corinth, etc., as we find in Scripture as well. The letters directed to cities. Cities had an outsized significance in the ancient world compared to the modern world, although we're going back to that way. Toronto has an outsized influence on Canadian identity. In fact, they think that they are Canada sometimes. They speak on behalf of everyone else and say this is what Canadian values are, when really it's just Toronto's values being foisted on the rest of the country. Same thing happens in New York, Los Angeles, London, Paris, and so forth, right? This is Canadian, this is Italian, this is French, this is whatever. Same thing will happen in China. Beijing, same thing. This is Chinese. Anybody from those countries will know, no, it's not. This is what the big cultural center says it is. Okay, that's going on there. But what they have in common is Homer. So the Greek, when Socrates comes along, and Socrates, by the way, is satirized in the comedies of the day. I mentioned Sophocles, Oedipus. There are comedies going on at the same time. Socrates is often a figure of fun in the comedy. So he's a very famous Athenian figure who eventually is put to death. Famously, he was forced to drink hemlock. I don't know if you read this in your philosophy class in the Apology. It's right at the end of his life. Usually taken the take on this is usually this is a sign of the intolerance of people for philosophy and so forth. I think it's a high sign of tolerance amongst the Athenians that they let him live till 70. He operated for 70 years, and eventually they gave him the hemlock to drink. But he was nonetheless put to death, and his most famous pupil, named Plato, made him a figure in all of his dialogues. And Plato did what Socrates himself didn't do, which is to write things down. Socrates wrote nothing. He was a famous figure cited by numerous others As I say, the comedians talk about him, but so does Xenophon, who's another famous writer, and others besides. So Socrates is a famous figure represented in others' writing, and he was a famous irritant to people around him, a gadfly. He would bite people, metaphorically. Right? He would go to the rich and the powerful, those who thought themselves wise, in particular the sophists, the wise ones, and he would who sold their teaching for great sums of money and said, "You are famous for this. Can you tell me about this then? Because I've been desperate to find out, and you are reputed for this. I know that you're the greatest of all the teachers. Teach me." And the way it always plays out is the sophist ends up being contradicting himself, being frustrated, wanting to punch Socrates in the nose, and eventually having to stop talking because he's embarrassing himself. That's how they all go, more or less. So he was a public figure. He, by the way, served in the military, Socrates, as every Athenian would have to do. Every Athenian citizen would have to do. Citizens were all males, by the way. He would be required to do this. And he's famous for saying that all he knew was that he knew nothing. So the sophists claimed to know everything. He claimed that he knew nothing. And yet he regularly exposed the sophists for not knowing what they're talking about. Well, that's going to create problems for you. It's a great angle, if you will. But I don't think it was just an angle. I actually think that it was part of his way of wisdom. And it was the antidote to pride. And I think it's a great model for students to adopt, is not to try and pretend to know things you don't know, but to ask questions. And what Plato called it was dialectic. As you see on the divided line here, again, this is taken probably, I think, from Book 6 of the Republic. Might be Book 5, can't recall. A little diagram, and on the left hand, you can see that there are things that are knowledge, and on the other hand, there are things that are merely opinion and not knowledge. The higher up you go, the more grounded, real, and admirable is the form of knowledge. So here we have genuine knowledge, and it's based on intelligence, noesis. It has this word nous in there, N-O-U-S, which is the Greek word for mind. And in Plato's understanding, the mind regards not objects, but the perfect forms themselves. So in this case, in the Republic, what it regards is justice. The philosopher who loves the good, the true, the beautiful, or in this case, the just, looks on justice and has to understand what it is before then applying it. What Thrasymachus does is look at the instances that are called justice, which are often injustice, and are often unjust, and concludes from that, on the basis of what he sees in the world, that there is no justice, effectively. It's just a word that the powerful use. Plato, or Socrates speaking through him, might say, that's true. There's often a great deal of injustice done in the name of justice, but does that mean that there's no justice? It cannot be so. And then he goes about to prove how that is so. That everyone, and C.S. Lewis, if you want to go to another source that presents it rather more simply, will talk about children in Mere Christianity, this is. We'll talk about how every person knows intuitively, through his intelligence, that there is such a thing as justice. And the illustration that Lewis uses, which I think is very good, is that on a playground, one child says to another when the one child does something unfair to the other, exactly that. That's not fair. You know this yourself. You experience it every day here. Your entire life is full of senses of injustices, unfairness. When you tell somebody that it's unfair, why do you tell them that it's unfair? How come? Why would you bother making these statements? Why would you be upset that the unfairness has happened? Yeah?
Well, it starts out as a gut reaction.
It's a gut reaction, but it's a gut reaction. There's more to it than a gut reaction. Of course it's a gut reaction. Like somebody steps on your toes, there's a gut reaction as well, but it's more than that. It's a sense. Go ahead.
Like a moral law?
Yeah, there's something that's been transgressed. And you have perceived it, and furthermore, you expect that the person you're speaking to understands that they have done so. That's why you say it to them. That's not fair. You expect, in fact, you, without any shadow of doubt in your mind, know that that person knows they've done the wrong thing. It's a gut reaction, yes, but it's a gut reaction predicated on a strong sense of right and wrong, which we call justice. And he says that everything depends on the fact that we know that there is such a thing as justice. And that the instances of injustice do nothing to destroy justice. They, on the contrary, make it clear that even things that call themselves just are often unjust. But that does not impinge on the fact that there is justice. So of course people are correct in perceiving injustice. Does that mean that there is no justice, which is what the social justice crowd currently operates upon, thinking that injustice can simply be rectified by redistribution of goods? To me, this just makes the maligned, the ill-treated, into the ill-treaters and the maligners. That doesn't solve the problem of injustice. It just creates a new category of oppressors. Why would anyone agree to this? Would moral superiority be given to those who took goods unjustly just because they didn't have them before? And the answer is no. They would have no moral high ground at all. At present, they do. There's a moral high ground because they're not being treated fairly. Let's give them their due. In certain instances, injustice does happen. There is exclusion. There is marginalization. Sure. How do we rectify that? We do it by upholding justice. That's how, says Socrates. Thrasymachus doesn't even come to that conclusion. He just simply, it is the way it is. It's the powerful getting what they want. Back to this. In terms of the levels of knowledge, the philosopher will look at, through his, and dialectic is the process that Socrates uses, by the way. There's a dialogue. These are all called dialogues. It's a discussion between two parties. And the aim of the discussion is to achieve knowledge in the areas of dispute. In this case, what's the nature of justice? So Plato's going to go through various suggestions at Socrates' hands and his interlocutors, his dialogue partners, about what the justice is. And a couple come forward. And eventually we get to the point where Socrates is telling us what he thinks the justice is and how the whole city should achieve this. Because he makes the point that it's very hard on an individual level to determine what justice is. It's just difficult. It's justice for me. Let's talk about it on a bigger scale. Because when we talk about justice, we tend to talk about courts of justice. We talk in civic contexts. Let's talk about it there, and then we can apply it backwards. What is justice for an individual? But let's look at it there. What would it be to do justice in the civic realm, in the city? And the first thing that he wants to do, and it seems to me the purpose of the Republic, while talking about justice, is to really talk about what should education be like if we want justice to take place. And this is why we're talking about it here in this class. Because Socrates is going to maintain that the current teachers of Greece, the poets like Homer, does not deal in reality. He does not deal in the realm of knowledge. He deals in the field of illusion and shadows at a third remove from reality. They don't know what they're talking about. It's presented in fancy images. It can be very appealing. It's very entertaining. They do have some sense of the moral good and so forth and evil, and they talk about that. But how well do they really know it? And do we not see, and I've said this already, this is the critique of Homer and the poets, is there not a sense that the gods themselves contradict fundamental justice all the time? They do bad things, and they get away with it because they're immortal. Is that just? They've got power, privilege, or they got all that. And they get away with it. How is that a just universe? Can't be the case. You can see that anyone who says this is going to be perceived and probably be rightly perceived to be attacking the theistic system of the day. And that's what he was executed for, by the way. He was given hemlock to drink because it was saying he was told to have corrupted the youth of Athens by profaning the gods. It's blasphemy. What Socrates was saying. This is blasphemy. Socrates said it's not true. The gods, if there are gods, and I think there are gods, must be just. And the poets are lying about the gods. That's the point. It's not that there are no gods, it's that what is being said about the gods is not true. Because any gods who are gods are going to uphold justice, truth, beauty, goodness, etc. They're going to uphold those things. So the critique then is of the educational system that is built upon the poets at this point. And what he proposes in its place is that instead of the poets running the show, it'll be the philosophers. Because the philosophers spend their life using dialectic, just like Socrates himself does, and they behold the just, and they seek to bring it about. They don't act like Thrasymachus. They don't act like the poets. They genuinely perceive the forms of the good, and they do it through the intellect, through dialogue. Whereas the poets are talking about physical objects in the world and are abstracting from it in the wrong way. They don't lead up to the idea of the thing. They give fanciful, poetic expression to that. They deal with shadows and images. It's all very entertaining, but how accurate is it? And the answer is it's not. What we get out of this is also something like Plato's version of the ideal state. It is not a democracy, by the way. This is interesting because Socrates is largely operating in the context of Athens, which is a democracy. Although there's a battle within that in terms of the history here, where it went from being a republic to a democracy, and Plato was not on board with what the Democrats did. This is a theme that you will find will also go into the Roman period. Democracy is a form of mob rule. It ends up devolving into that, where what is good and just and true and best ends up being discarded for the purposes of expedience. And we're better off having aristocrats, those who are the best, run the show. And the best, in Plato's understanding, are the philosophers. They're not the best because of their birth. They're the best because they look at the best. They uphold the best. They live for the best, etc. By the way, as for Plato, he was so committed to what Socrates had taught that he established something called an academy, the word we use to this very day, that's after Plato, which lasted for 900 years. Plato's Academy. That's pretty good. If you take the oldest universities that we know of, this is not the same sort of thing, a university and the academy, but still, the oldest educational institutions that we have probably are in Cambridge, Oxford University, maybe Paris, Bologna, who knows. And we're talking about 1200, so 800 years. So they're not quite there yet. Will they last as long as Plato's Academy did? Not sure at this stage. But these are all dialectical treatises. The 25 dialogues that we have in existence, he's writing about using this method of dialectic. And the purpose of dialectic is to instruct the reader into how to think about things. And this is why it is used in humanities subjects. The lecture is a form of dialogue. Now, in the sense, it's a monologue, but there's an engagement with it. You can ask questions. You can also boil it down and then literally get into dialectic, an exchange of ideas back and forth. And some adopt that as the Socratic method for teaching. Very useful. But this is a hierarchy, the republic, the ideal city-state, and it, as I said, it's effectively an oligarchy of philosophers running the show. And here justice will prevail. Now, what does that look like when you boil it down? Well, it's sort of a police state. The philosophers know what the good is, what the just is. There are people there to enforce the will of the philosophers on the populace, and everyone will be happier for it. And those who are motivated by the least admirable human characteristics will be kept in their place. Because not everyone is going to do what's good and just all the time. We'll keep them from positions of influence then. Yeah, the takes on this vary quite widely, whether this is totalitarian, some have said, and some have said that it is the ideal. It is a dialogue, needless to say. By the way, there was a leader in Syracuse, I believe, who asked Plato to bring it about, and it didn't work very well. At any rate, the ultimate goal of this is to illustrate what justice is for the individual, but he does it by looking at the big picture. Okay, so the theory of forms, which you see here on the A, B, and so forth, the forms are what we behold when we talk about a just instance. So when I said at the outset, when a child says to another, that's not fair, what they have in mind is the idea of justice. They're looking at that and saying, this doesn't match up to that. And note that the child already has that. They intuit it. They don't even have to be taught it. They know when injustice happens. There are studies by psychologists of babies even that illustrate that babies get angry when they see something unjust happen. Their faces go red. It's really interesting. It's not a physical response, it's a moral response. They get outraged. They already know what's right and wrong, in other words, from birth. That's what Plato maintains. We know that intuitively. You don't have to be taught what justice is. You already know. Now, a Christian would add, how do you know that? What makes it so that you would intuit that injustice has happened? And the answer would be because we all bear the image of God. Everyone. Plato is not going to come to that conclusion. Because in the Greek conception, the citizens have that, and the citizens are all adult males with property. And the Greeks have slaves. And they also have women and children, and they don't have the rights of citizens. So Plato's idea here, appealing to justice, etc., is not applied consistently. However, it will be by Christians, because Christians are going to say that men and women bear the image of God. And children also bear the image of God. Now, they're in a different stage and so forth, but nonetheless, you can't just do whatever you want with children. You have to treat them with dignity, respect, etc., in accordance with their age and stage. But that's a Christian conception. Still, Plato is leaning in the right direction here by pointing us to a justice, a standard that applies to everyone. He's just restrictive in his application at this stage. For Plato, there is the ideal community is property-owning males. acting rationally. They act in accordance with what they know is best. They think, they have a discussion about it, and then they act upon it. Those who are not able to do that, they're not ready for that, the children or the slaves who are not able to do what they know is best, they have to do what they're told, they can't be considered in this republic. They're there and they, to some degree, support this whole system, but they can't be involved in the decision-making processes because they're committed to being out of the situation of slavery. They're not going to support it. Anyway, he maintains that this realm of the forms is more real than the world of appearances. And the appeal to fairness or justice is the proof of it. We're appealing to a higher authority. So he gives an analogy. He says that reason is to the form of the good as the eye is to the sun. And then he comes up with what he calls the allegory of the cave. Now let me say something about the allegory of the cave. I've often used a video at this stage. I wonder if I can find it here. Take 2 seconds. It won't take me long.
Imagine prisoners that have spent their entire lives chained deep inside a cave.
I'll wait till it lights up for you. What it's going to do is it's going to give a very brief pictorial representation of Plato's allegory of the cave. So what he's been trying to illustrate thus far is what the ideal republic is like. Now what he's going to do in the allegory of the cave is to pictorially represent what human life is like. Human life is like being chained and facing the wall of a cave on which there are images. But reality is behind you. And it casts, and there's a play of figures behind you, and the light shines on these figures, and it's on the wall of the cave. And you look at that all the time. You can't help but that's the posture of your life. You're looking at the shadow play on the wall. And you think, because you've only looked at the shadows on the wall, that is what the world is. Whereas it's actually stuff going on behind you, and if you actually left the cave, you would find that outside of the cave, that's the real thing. Now, what Plato is going to maintain, I'll show you this brief 3-minute clip, is that the philosopher is, by virtue of his love of justice, the good, the beautiful, the true, is against his own best wishes, almost, dragged out of the cave. And why does he have to be dragged out of the cave? Because he knows that if he goes against the group are going to hate him. They're going to despise him for questioning their gods. They're going to despise him for upsetting the apple cart, upsetting the group. But he says, but that's the high calling of the philosopher, is to state the truth irrespective of the consequences. And his proof positive of that is Socrates himself, who so loved the good and the just that he was willing to be sacrificed because he thought it was better to uphold those things, which were the foundation of the city, even if the city hated him for it. Because he so loved the city that he was willing to incur the wrath of the city. Now, just to add a little bit of spice to it, the people that put the shadows on the walls are the poets, which the people believe in. Okay, so now I'll show it to you.
Imagine prisoners that have spent their entire lives chained deep inside a cave. They have been chained so that they cannot see behind themselves, and they are forced to stare endlessly at the cave wall in front of them. Behind them, a fire is burning, and between the prisoners and the fire is a raised walkway. Now imagine that each day a menagerie of objects crosses the walkway. Animals and people carrying their wares to market. Their shapes create an intricate shadow play on the wall in front of the prisoners. This is the only world that the prisoners have ever known. The shadows and the echoes of unseen objects. Now, imagine that a prisoner is released. After some time adjusting to the blinding light, the freed prisoner will begin to experience the world outside of the cave for the very first time. And it is like nothing he could have ever imagined. With his new perception of the world, the man will of course want to return to his friends to share his incredible discoveries. But the prisoners cannot recognize their old friend. He appears as all things do. His voice is a distorted echo, and his body is a grotesque shadow. They cannot understand his fantastic stories of the world outside of the cave. To them, it will never exist. This, of course, does not make the world outside of the cave any less real.
Indeed, that's the point. It does not make the world outside the cave any less real. Although they deny it, and they will kill the one who says that that is the reality and the world that they are living in is a world of shadows, insubstantial, contradicting that. So, to my mind, this speaks about a number of issues. One of them is the whole purpose of higher education, which is to investigate what justice is, among other things, and not just simply agree to what the crowd says about it, even if they seem to be appealing to the right things and do it in the name of justice, etc. What is the just? Is it a universal standard? Because everybody's understanding of justice is that. That's why you are upset, because you're not being treated with the full dignity of somebody who is an image bearer of God. Hence the feeling of injustice. You're being treated as a group rather than as an individual. You are not getting a fair shake in life. And how do we rectify that? Well, by making sure that that does happen. Plato's whole shtick here, it's not a shtick, but his whole dialogue is built on where it concludes in Book 10, which is a rather shocking turn of events, which is that he says that in his ideal republic that the poets will be thrown out. It's not just that they'll be displaced by the philosophers, the poets will have to be banished. Because they only ever teach about shadows and such things. And they lead people away from the good, the true, the beautiful, and the just. Now, Plato is not anti-poetic. If you read his dialogues in Greek, they are poetic masterpieces themselves. And as you've seen already, Plato regularly uses poetic devices like analogy, the allegory of the cave. There are all sorts of different instances, even in this book, The Republic, which uses poetic tools. He's not against literary language. He is against accepting that poetic depictions of things like the gods should be held to be true when they're plainly immoral and unjust. And so, historically, Christians have regarded Plato as a friend. Not that he's a Christian, but that he is a critique of false religion. And his idea of the good, the true, the beautiful, the just are things that Christians themselves are going to see as truths connected with the person and work of Christ. He is good, he is true, he is beautiful, he is just, he is all those things. In fact, God represents those things in a way that Plato never knew. But the critique of it was valid. And so then the question is, just because Plato's notion of the Republic is flawed in certain respects, although again, remember when he's talking about an ideal republic, he's really talking about faculties there. And the philosophers represent reason in the mind. And the chess, the thumos, represents the police, the things that pushes you to act and make sure that bad things don't happen and make sure that's like the police, your chest, your virtues. And what they do is they keep your passions in place. It's really about you. How do you regulate yourself? How do you make sure you do the right thing? It is about the individual. I'm not sure he's ever really talking about how a republic should be ideally. It's just a means of illustrating a smaller point. How do you become a just person is really the focus of this dialogue. And the political side of it, I think, somewhat detracts from the main case, which is the way you do this is by, through your mind, you understand what is good, true, beautiful, just, and then your virtues act in accordance with that. They're regulated by it, rather than letting your desires to lead you on this. Otherwise, anyone committed to their own desires is simply going to fall into injustice and not consider the greater good, or the fact that everyone else also bears the image of God and they deserve some sort of treatment equitable to that standard. Yes? I can't hear.
Excuse me. Would our desires actually then be regarded as unjust?
Yes.
They would be.
Yes. They contradict. They contradict the fundamental principles of justice. So there's a war within the human person between the passions and the reason. Passions want certain things. The reason will regulate that and say, no. Which one of them wins? Well, in most people, the passions win, is the truth. The crowd in particular are motivated by their passions. They can perceive injustice and they can be mobbed into violence and so forth because of the outrage of it, but are they really doing the just thing by lynching people? And the answer is no, they're not. That happens within a person as well. Just because you feel that it is an injustice doesn't mean that executing the injustice yourself is the right way forward. Right? We have a criminal justice system for a reason. Otherwise, you just take justice into your own hands, like in the playground, and punch the person that stepped on your foot.
Would you say that we can have desires that are also just like having passion for justice?
Again, sorry?
Would you say that we can have desires and passions for acts of justice?
Yes, we can. And that's the whole goal. Because we can't divide ourselves. Your passions ultimately have to be in accord with what is good, just, true, beautiful. Your reason has to lead you to what that is. But then your passions have to fit with that. And they have to be trained to do so. But first of all, you have to love the good, the true, the beautiful, the just. You have to love it. That's what motivates you away from your own selfish interests. So note that there's a positive incentive there. And I think Plato is very wise in recognizing this. It's not enough to hate injustice. That's what modern superheroes do. You already heard me on this. But I'll repeat myself, because the modern superhero fights crime and injustice and so forth. But do they stand for justice? They never discuss it. If they did, they would recognize that within each person there's also the potential for injustice, and they would have to regulate themselves, so they would have to exhibit moral character. But they don't do that. The Justice League is a faux Justice League. It's just a word. There's nothing behind it. The bad guys are bad because what? I don't know. They're trying to, who knows what they do crazy things, like they want to destroy the whole planet and own everything, and they don't even, it doesn't even have any plausible motive usually. But they're the bad guys, and they have superpowers as well. So what's the difference? I don't even know. I guess the good guys are on the side of the rest of us, and the bad guys are against the rest of us. So that's it. Is there a connection between justice and moral virtue in contemporary superhero comic book fiction? And the answer is no. Then it's not justice. Because justice is related to goodness. And to have goodness, you have to have a sense of badness or wrong. It's not just about being on sides. The education system has followed the comic books in misrepresenting what justice and injustice is. It's not about sides. Note that the philosophers are not on a side. They're not on the side of Athens against the Spartans. They're on the side of the just against, in this case, the Athenian people and their rulers. Right? Christians will also notice that this sounds very much like the prophetic mandate of the church, who regularly speak against their rulers and their priests. Right? The prophet's a marginal figure criticizing the establishment for corruption. Why do they do it? They love God, the good, the true, and the beautiful, and they recognize that the people who are said to follow God are supposed to be like him, but they're not, and therefore the critique comes. They're like the philosophers. They're also going to be chained, poisoned, shot, executed, whatever. But they love the good. So there's an analogy there, and the analogy has been applied historically. But here it's specifically against the poets, and it's about education then. Who should be doing the paideia? Who should be doing the education of the young? Because that, at the end of the day, is the most important issue. I still think it is, but I'm an educator, so I'm biased. I think, who is going to educate the young, and what are you going to teach them? This is the issue in Canada and in any country, because it's not about my self-interest, it's about me putting aside my self-interest for the sake of the future. For people who have no power or privilege or access, how am I going to educate them, and why? And when you get that right, everything else falls in line. Yes, sir.
Well, how is it possible with these, what we're talking about here, for the good or the just to become the majority or like the masses, right? Because each time we're bringing it up, it's always they're kind of the minority speaking against everyone else. Everyone else is in the wrong, and we need to remind them of that. And you can even see the church in our past, when we got into power, we fell apart and we're just as bad as before. So how can we ever really get to a point of good and just if we're always coming from the side of pointing out the masses are wrong?
So this is a very good question. I don't buy that the church is just as bad. I don't buy it. I don't. I don't think history bears up under that judgment. It does not support that judgment. However, it doesn't mean that injustices were not done by the church. That's clearly the case. Clearly, in some instances. But I would say that the institutions that are revered are legacy of the church. So the university is a medieval Christian institution. I talked about Plato and the academy. The academy fell into ruin. And the university, as I say, is a Christian institution, and it unites all fields of knowledge. And it's rooted in the fact that God is the essence of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and the just. The Greeks had no conception of this, that God represented those things. Plato sort of was leaning that way. This is how God ought to be. But he didn't know. Christians did know, and the university was founded on that. Okay, what else do we have as institutions from the church? Orphanages, hospices, hospitals, school movements. These are Christian. Social welfare agencies, looking to the poor. Overseas missions, not for the sake of colonialism, but for the sake of sharing the gospel and helping people with health, welfare, education. That's what missionaries do when they go overseas. The criticism that they have abused their power is valid. Is the world better for Christianity or worse? It is unquestionably better in my mind. It's unquestionably better, and it's not even close. But you will not hear that in Canada, and you might not even hear it here that much. The residential schools episode. My ancestors died in a residential school. The Mohawk Institute. That's my distant couple of generations back. I don't know how many sons died in that institute. Several. The mother who bore those children who were taken away from her died of a heartbreak when she was in her early 40s. It's a real thing. Is it the fault of the church? Because last year when they were talking about the residential schools and the unmarked graves and all that stuff, and people were outraged and they were burning churches and so forth, they have yet to find a single unmarked grave. It was a charge without a basis in fact. It was just a charge. People assumed that it was correct because they knew that schools were started by Christians, which they were, and they were outreach to the natives of this country, and they intended good. There were also hospices, hospitals, those were all there. They got taken over by the government, mandated federally, required that you attend them. Now we get residential schools. I think it's a government issue more than a church issue. Churches collaborated with the government because they thought, they can fund this and the goods can improve. What they didn't realize is this is the devil's bargain. Because now you're mandating something. That's very different than offering something freely. Requiring, taking kids away from their families, taking them great distances at times. You never see your kids again. Is that just? Like, are you really helping the child then? Are you helping the family? It's an assault on the family. So I don't buy the take, but I do think that there are cases where you can obviously show that the church does wrong things, and that's because Christians still sin, which you also don't hear in churches sometimes, which is an extraordinary thing. But comment or question? Or no? You sure? Okay, anytime. So I would say that as a legacy is there. Also the idea of equality under the law. Where do we get that from? It's the idea that we have rights and freedoms by virtue of being human beings. Where does that come from? It's not the ancient Greeks. They had slaves. We think slavery is abhorrent, even while sex slaves pour across the border and get abused and so forth, and we turn a blind eye to it. But still, that'll end eventually. The transgressions are heaping up. We still think it's wrong. We just don't do anything about it, but it's still wrong. Well, eventually somebody's going to say, we're not going to tolerate this any longer. When enough disgust wells up in people to say, we're going to put a stop to this. But slavery, which is a natural human institution in the sense that it's a product of sinful humanity, Christians have always pushed against it. And when they affirmed it, the consequences of it were so severe within the context of the countries concerned that they divided up over it and went to war over it. That's the legacy of south of the border. Barbaric. Should not happen. As I say, south of the border, they fought, and it divided the country in a way that is the worst way you can divide a country. A civil war is the worst. Puts families at one another's throats for generations. I'm not sure the wounds ever heal from that. But they thought it was worth it because they thought that slavery was so heinous. So yes, the injustice happens. And what did they do in that instance but fight the injustice, believing that there was such thing as justice? That's the only reason. At the end of the day, there's probably financial implications and all that. You'll find people did it for various motives. At the end of the day, you cannot motivate millions of people to go to war voluntarily without a belief in the ideal that they're fighting for. Doesn't happen. So I think it's profound. I think it's important. I put it on the course here, even though it's outside of what is traditionally called literature, because it deals with Plato, it deals with the issues of justice, but it also deals with the poets, and it introduces a sense of transformation here. I still put Homer on the course. I still think Homer is the greatest poet. I still think later poets appeal to Homer, including our friend Virgil, who we'll read next time. He still has an idea of what an epic is. An epic is essential for biblical understanding as well. A great hero who undertakes an enormous odyssey in which the world is at stake and a nation is built. This is a story that the Bible also talks about. It's a form of literature that we still read and like. All of you, to my knowledge, liked the Odyssey. It's not just you liked it, you thought it was great. And it is. How come it's still great? It's a very different world. Yes, but the things that were great about it have not gone away. These are permanent things. Yes?
I wanted to ask a question about that, touching on justice, and in history as well. Are there things that are great or just that are non-subjective, but this is right, this is wrong, and we see that because it's a pattern in history or in journals or stories. And then are there ever things that are just, and then depending on the country or the culture that you live in as well, that it may differ or vary? Not that the human rights are changed, but there's also things that you may find just, or should everyone be the same in terms of no matter where you go?
Okay, that's a series of questions, which I'll try and address. So, are there things that are just and good and true and beautiful, irrespective of age, culture, perspective, and so forth? It's a good question. We tend to hear in our day that there aren't any, which is why we need to be inclusive and tolerant, etc., because there's no monopoly on these things. I happen to agree there's no monopoly on these things. I think it is the inheritance of every human being in every culture and every race. It is an inheritance that they have been ushered into whether they realized it or not. And I still think that it exists there, and it's called common grace. It's the realm that we would call common grace. God's ways are seen in the fabric of the cosmos, in human history. God's ways are known, whether with his special people, Israel, the Christians, or whether it's seen in the nations that even oppose. His ways are made known. And I think people have recognized this across cultures. It's not just a identity group that we call the Christians or the religious. All religions hold to this sense of right and wrong. C.S. Lewis calls it the Tao in a book called The Abolition of Man. I lectured on it just a week or two ago in my C.S. Lewis class. And what modern education does is deny that. It denies that there is a common human agreement on right and wrong. But Lewis demonstrates in this book that there is an extraordinary degree of consensus on what right and wrong is with respect to a wide array of things. Whether it's Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Confucianism, you name it. There's almost a consensus on moral good and moral evil. There are some differences, of course, but there's a consensus. And why is there consensus? Because it is intuitive. It's sort of, we know it's so. And so why would literature be able to preserve this? Precisely for that reason. Because you didn't have to be a Christian to read Homer. Homer wasn't one. And his story had a universal appeal nonetheless, and it still does. Because human nature hasn't changed. It's been represented in various ways, but the nature itself has not changed. And Plato further dug down on that in the Republic. What is at stake here? It's these things that he calls the forms. So I think that they have not passed away. There are good and permanent things. As I say, modern education denies them. They talk about them being values, which we can't know about. And they usher in what comes in the wake of that, which is cultural relativism. Oh yes, this is how Christians have perceived it, or this is how the West has perceived it, or Canadians have perceived it. But is that how the way the Africans would perceive it, or the Chinese, or the Native Americans? Would they perceive it this way? Would they? The answer is yes, actually. But they suggest that it might not be so, so we shouldn't act as if it were so. It might not be so, but actually it is so. And since it is so, why wouldn't you continue to do that? And the answer is because there are people who want to remake human nature in accordance with what they believe about reality. And it's in their interests and for their power and to act upon their privilege. It's a great book, The Abolition of Man. You should read it. What was the second question? It's related to that. It's interconnected with it, is it not?
It is.
This is why literature remains, though, so readable. Even with like the passage of time, different languages, translation, it's still so good. How is that even possible? And it's because there is a common human nature which is depicted there. We do the Greeks, the Romans, and so forth because this is the seedbed for Christianity. It's also the place where the vocabulary for the intellectual life is given voice. In Greek philosophy, we get the terms politics, ethics, you name it. Epistemology. Whoa, I knew that was going to happen. That's a big crash. Let me try this again. I really can't hear.
I'm just saying, like in the New Testament, where it's saying there are people who are eating meat or not eating meat, like don't eat meat with them, or eat meat with them, or how do you adjust, or is there room for adjustment in different cultures and societies when it comes to this? Yeah, and then deciding if you go to a culture where you don't agree, where do you draw the line?
Well, so you're drawing very specific application to this general principle. And now it deals with ethical and religious principles and cultural practices. And this is resolved in Acts 15. Go look at the Jerusalem Council, and they talk about the Christianity 101, what are the essences of the gospel? And it's not a matter of eating and drinking. It had been. You would have identified yourself as a Christian, like Peter was given. Is it Acts 9 where Peter is told to kill and eat, and he's told to kill and eat these various beasts that were unclean? He said, never, I'm never going to do that because I'm a practicing Jew. I'm not going to eat these animals. And he says, that is the Lord in response to him, don't call unclean that what I have made clean. It was unclean, by the way, he called it, but now he's made it clean. And then, and this is the immediate application, he gets brought in the proximity of a man who's not a Jew, who wants to know how he can get into the temple, because that's where God is. And he shares with him the gospel. The Ethiopian eunuch, why can't he get in the temple? Because he's a eunuch. He's been castrated. He can't go into the temple. He's forbidden to go in there. He's excluded from the presence of God. But the temple had been torn, the veil from top to bottom. Now he has access. Don't call that man unclean. Do not call him unfit for the kingdom of God. So there's a breakdown of the categories. The categories were there to show the holiness code. God remains holy, but holiness is not national identity. It's not about foods per se. But that was a sort of a illustration, which is no longer true. Now, we couldn't come to that ourselves, but God says that it is so. Is that an answer? Right? So we start with Greco-Roman literature for the reasons that I suggested. It's where the gospel also integrates, the Christian faith integrates with the ancient world. And it holds on to some of it, and it transforms some of it. Among the most important thing it transforms is the idea of grace and justice, because God experienced injustice in order to do his justice. Was it just for God to be crucified? It was the foremost illustration of injustice, in fact. That he should bear all of our sins, and that we should be given a clean slate, even though we wanted him to be crucified. This is the unjust action in the whole of human history. And yet that's where God did his justice. He pronounced us innocent by pronouncing his son to be guilty. He bore the weight of human sin, and he rose from the dead. Most importantly, he rose from the dead. The one who bore our sins, took on the injustice of the world, is now the Lord and Savior, and he reigns. So his kingdom of justice ought to reign wherever people are. That's part of the whole gospel. And it transforms cultures. And that's what we're going to see on the course, that it does have a leavening effect. It starts to change things. Compassion, loving your enemies, these become features of Christianity. Showing mercy to those who don't deserve it. Aristotle would never do this. That would be unjust. Not enslaving your enemies and making them your property. Unthinkable. Of course you're going to do that. A Christian's going to say, no, that is a person who bears the image of God. I think I can do better with this person. As I say, it's not without contradiction, but there's a shift that happens there. Decisive. Other comments, questions? Okay. Well, I've already brought down the show here with this thing. Hopefully it continued to record.